in the dead of a brutal winter, where the wind howled like a grieving spirit. 16-year-old Lila stood abandoned on a jagged, ice-crusted ridge. Her wrists stung from the coarse rope that had bound her, her breath forming fragile clouds in the freezing air. Her father, a man carved from unyielding tradition, hadn't listened when he learned of her pregnancy. Without a word of mercy, he dragged her into the wilderness, handing her over to a stranger like a traded beast. The man who took her wasn't the villain she'd braced for. Broad as a cedar, with a silence that felt both heavy and deliberate, he pointed to a weathered cabin and turned away, disappearing into a nearby shed as if she were merely a crate left in the snow. Lila, her swollen belly a quiet weight beneath her frayed cloak, stood shivering, her face still burning from her father's parting blow. He'd ridden off without a glance, the crunch of his horse's hooves fading into the mountain's vast silence. The cabin's door creaked open, spilling a warm glow across the rough-hewn floorboards. Inside, the space was stark. A single cot tucked in a corner, a scarred table beside a tin basin, and a row of furs hanging on pegs next to a rifle mounted above the hearth. Lila hesitated, her boots crunching frost onto the threshold, then stepped inside, letting the door thud shut behind her. The wind's wail pressed against the walls as she sank to the floor by the fire, curling her arms around her middle. Her heart churned with fear and defiance, her father's words echoing like a curse. "Your shame will not defile our home." He'd torn her from her bed at dawn, his grip bruising her arm, his voice a low growl. "You're no longer my daughter." The wagon ride had been a cold eternity, the clatter of wheels and her stifled sobs her only companions. Now, in this stranger's cabin, the fire's crackle was her sole comfort until heavy boots thudded on the porch. The man entered, his frame filling the doorway, a wolf pelt coat draped over his shoulders. His beard was thick, his eyes shadowed beneath a knit cap. He spared her a single glance before tossing a pair of grouse by the hearth and setting to work with a knife that glinted in the firelight. Lila's voice, trembling but firm, broke the silence. "What's your name?" she asked. He didn't look up, his hand steady on the blade. "Ezra," he said, his voice flat as slate. She pressed on, her breath catching. "Why am I here?" His knife paused mid-cut. "Your father's doing, not mine," he said, the words landing like a weight. Lila swallowed hard, refusing to let tears fall. She cried enough on the journey. That night, she stayed by the fire, too proud to take the cot he didn't offer, her hands cradling the faint stir of life within her, the only piece of her world still hers. Days settled into a quiet, uneasy rhythm. Ezra left at dawn, his boots crunching through the snow, returning at dusk with firewood or game. His presence was constant yet distant, like a mountain looming on the horizon. He didn't touch her, didn't ask questions, rarely met her eyes. Lila swept the cabin's dusty floor, her hands clumsy as she tried to cook with the sparse provisions. Her father had kept her from the kitchen, calling it her mother's place before death claimed her when Lila was 9. On the 6th morning, she woke to a sharp pain and a stain of blood on her skirt. Panic clawed at her chest, and her cry echoed through the cabin. Ezra burst through the door, snow dusting his coat, a hatchet gripped in his hand. "It's too soon," she gasped, clutching her belly, her voice breaking. Without a word, he dropped the hatchet, scooped her up, and carried her to the cot. "Please," she whispered, her hands trembling, "don't let me lose my baby." He piled furs over her, stoked the fire to a roar, and boiled water in a dented kettle, his movement steady, but his jaw tight with focus. Hours passed, the pain ebbing, the bleeding slowing. The child was safe. That night, Ezra sat against the far wall, his silhouette sharp against the firelight. "You didn't have to help me," Lila said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He grunted, eyes fixed on the flames. "Don't make it more than it was," he said, but a slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. Weeks unfolded, and Lila began to notice the small, unspoken gestures. A second mug appeared on the table at meals, unmentioned. A thick quilt, newly woven, was left folded by the hearth. Her worn boots, patched overnight, sat neatly by the door. Ezra wasn't warm, not in the way of storybook heroes, but he wasn't cruel. He was a man shaped by solitude, his kindness carved in quiet acts. Then a blizzard descended, a howling beast that trapped them inside for days. Food dwindled to scraps of bread and dried meat. Words were sparse. Pass the kettle or mind the draft. But when Lila slipped on the icy path outside, bruising her hip, Ezra's voice sharpened with worry. "What were you doing out there?" he asked, kneeling beside her as she winced. "I needed water," she said, pain lacing her words. "I told you I'd get it," he snapped and softened, fetching a cloth to wrap her injury. She flinched instinctively, and he froze, his hands hovering. "I'm not like him," he said, low and firm. "I don't raise a hand to anyone." Lila's breath caught, her eyes stinging. "No one's ever said that to me before," she admitted. He didn't respond, just bandage her hip with careful hands, his calluses brushing her skin like a promise. By the 8th week, a fever gripped Lila, burning through her like wildfire. She lay trembling, her vision blurring, as Ezra's hand pressed her forehead, his face tight with something close to fear. Without a word, he saddled his mule and rode into the storm, returning 2 days later, frost clinging to his beard, his hands raw from the cold. He carried a small sack of herbs and a vial of bitter tea. Lila drank, the taste sharp on her tongue, and slept, waking to find the fever gone. "Why'd you risk that?" she asked, her voice weak but steady. He shrugged, staring at the floor. "Couldn't just watch you fade," he said, the words heavy with unspoken weight. Spring crept in, slow and muddy, the air softening but still sharp at dawn. Lila's belly grew, a quiet vow beneath her patched dress. Ezra never asked about the child, but she caught his glances, quick, cautious, like he feared lingering too long. He began leaving small offerings, a loaf of bread by the fire, a carved wooden rabbit on the windowsill, a bucket of warm water for her to soak her swollen feet. One day, a stray dog followed him home, its ribs sharp, one ear torn. Lila named it Ash for the way it curled near the hearth's embers. Ezra tossed a tattered blanket for it to lie on, saying nothing. When Ash began trailing Lila, its tail wagging, she smiled. "Guess he knows who sneaks him scraps," she said. Ezra's lips twitched, the closest he'd come to a smile. One night, under a sky blazing with stars, Ezra broke the silence. "How long until the baby comes?" he asked, his eyes flicking to her belly. 5 months, maybe 6, she said, startled by his question. He nodded, then asked, "The father, what's the story?" Lila's throat tightened. He was a preacher's son. "Promised me a life, then called me a liar when I told him I was carrying his child. My father believed him over me." Ezra's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. "That's not justice," he said, and it wasn't pity in his voice. It was a shared understanding, raw and real. "Why'd you take me in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his hand still. "Your father pulled me from a frozen river years ago. I owed him a debt." The truth stung, but it settled in her chest. She wasn't a gift or a burden. She was a debt, yet Ezra treated her like more. The baby came too soon, pain ripping through Lila like a gale. She tried to stay silent, biting her lip until it bled, but her cries woke Ezra. He moved with purpose, boiling water, laying out clean cloths, his voice steady as he guided her through the agony. "You're stronger than this," he said, letting her grip his hand until his knuckles whitened. When the child arrived, a tiny girl with a cry that shook the cabin's walls, Lila wept, not from pain but from a fierce, overwhelming joy. Ezra wrapped the baby in a soft cloth, handing her to Lila with a gentleness that belied his rough hands. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice soft as the firelight. "Grace," Lila whispered. "She's my miracle." Ezra's eyes glistened, but he said nothing, sitting close through the night, watching over them both. 3 days later, a knock shattered the quiet. Ezra opened the door to a boy, no older than 14, his face streaked with dirt and fear. "I'm looking for Lila," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm her brother, Noah." Lila's heart stopped. "They told me you were dead," she whispered, clutching Grace. Noah shook his head, his eyes wide. "Father said you drowned. Ma's sick. She told me the truth before she got worse." Their mother had confessed that their father had banished Lila to hide the scandal tide to the preacher's son. "Ma needs you," Noah said, his voice breaking. Lila looked at Ezra, then at Grace, and murmured, "This is my home now." But she knew she had to go. The journey to town was grueling. Grace bundled against Lila's chest, Noah leading the mule through the thawing trails. The townsfolk stared, their eyes more curious than cruel, whispering as Lila passed. At her mother's bedside, she found a woman frail as a leaf, her breath shallow. "I failed you," her mother whispered, her fingers brushing Grace's tiny hand. Lila nodded, tears falling, forgiveness settling like a quiet dawn. 3 days later, her mother was gone. The preacher's son faced justice, thanks to Noah's courage in speaking out. Their father had fled, a coward's escape from the town's growing whispers. Lila and Noah left, vowing never to return. Back at the cabin, Ezra stood on the porch, his eyes searching hers. "You came back," he said, his voice thick with relief. Lila handed him Grace, who cooed up at him. "Told you I would," she said, a small smile breaking through. The cabin felt fuller now, with Noah sleeping by the hearth, his face soft in the firelight, and Ezra's steady presence anchoring them. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Months turned to seasons, the ridge softening under summer's touch. Grace grew, chasing ash through the mud, her laughter a melody. Noah learned to chop wood, his thin frame filling out with strength. Ezra carved a cradle, leaving it by the back wall without a word, its smooth edges a quiet gift. One night, a rock crashed through the window, a note tied to it. "The child is a stain. The mother sin lingers. We're coming." Lila's resolve hardened like steel. Ezra set traps along the trails, taught Noah to watch for strangers. They prepared not in fear, but in defiance of those who sought to harm them. When 3 men came at dawn, their faces shadowed with intent, Lila was ready. Ezra fired a warning shot, sending the first stumbling to his knees. Noah sprang a rope trap, tripping the second. Lila stepped from the trees, her knife gleaming in the pale light. "You came for my daughter," she said, her voice cold as the ridge itself. "You'll answer for it." They found lanterns and oil in the men's packs, meant to burn the cabin to ash. A marshal arrived the next day, taking the men in chains. "You did what you had to," he told Lila, his voice gruff with respect. The trial was swift. The preacher's allies scattered, and the town began to change, whispers giving way to truth. Years passed, and the ridge became a haven. Grace's laughter rang through the trees, her small hands clutching wildflowers. Noah stayed, building a life beside them, his boyish grin replaced by a quiet strength. Ezra carved a ring from birch, offering it to Lila one evening under the stars. "Never thought I'd want a life like this," he said, his voice soft. She took the ring, her smile warm. "You already chose it," she said. The cabin grew loud with life. Meals shared, stories told, grief a shadow but joy a brighter flame. When Ezra fell ill, his breath fading under the pines where they buried him, Lila stayed by his side, holding his hand until the end. Grace placed a carved dove on his grave, whispering, "Pa's resting now." Lila grew old on the ridge, her hair silver, her hands worn but steady. The ledger that once branded her a burden was long gone, but her story lived on, carried by women who found courage in her fire. The mountain held her, Grace, Noah, and Ezra's memory, woven into its roots. From betrayal, she forged strength. From exile, a family. From pain, a hard-earned peace. Lila carried that peace with every step, every breath a testament to the life she'd built.